The luxury jewelry store sparkled under the bright showroom lights, every diamond and gemstone perfectly arranged to catch the eye of potential buyers. The atmosphere was one of quiet elegance, velvet-lined display cases, crisp-suited employees, and customers who exuded wealth. Then, she walked in. The woman wasn't wearing designer clothes. She wasn't draped in jewelry, and she didn't have the air of someone who spent weekends in private clubs. Instead, she wore a simple blouse and jeans. Her hair was neatly tied back, and her shoes, though clean, weren't the high-end brands the store's usual clientele favored. The moment she stepped through the doors, a store clerk, a tall, immaculately dressed man, gave her one glance and immediately dismissed her. She walked up to a glass case where a diamond bracelet sat on a soft blue cushion. It shimmered under the lights, catching her attention. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Could I see this one?" The clerk barely concealed his irritation. He was used to dealing with serious buyers, people who arrived in tailored suits, who asked for items to be delivered rather than carrying them home in a bag. The woman before him didn't fit the profile. "This piece is quite expensive," he said, his tone carrying the slightest hint of condescension. She smiled. "That's all right. I'd just like to see it." The clerk hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't think this is in your price range. But I'd be happy to show you something more affordable." He motioned toward a smaller section of the store where the cheaper, less dazzling jewelry was displayed. The woman's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, looking at the bracelet once more before turning away. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm. She walked toward the exit, her posture graceful, not hurried. She didn't argue. She didn't insist. But just as she reached the door, a deep voice called out behind her. "Ma'am, wait." A man in a dark suit rushed into the store, his face pale as if he had just received shocking news. He was followed by the store manager, a middle-aged woman whose usually composed face was filled with panic. The clerk blinked in confusion as the two hurried past him, stopping directly in front of the woman he had just dismissed. "I sincerely apologize for the treatment you received," the suited man said, bowing slightly. The woman nodded but remained silent. The manager turned, eyes locking onto the stunned clerk. "What did you just do?" she demanded, her voice low and sharp. The clerk stammered. I was just assisting a customer." "No," the manager snapped. "You just refused service to," she cut herself off, swallowing hard. The woman lifted a hand gently. "It's all right." But the manager's face remained pale. It was not all right. The suited man gestured toward the back of the store. "Please, come with me. We have much to discuss." At that moment, the realization hit the clerk like a freight train. Who was this woman? Why were the highest-ranking people in the store treating her as if she were royalty? The other employees watched in hushed silence as she walked toward the back room, her posture still composed, unshaken by the way she had been treated. And the clerk, his confidence suddenly gone, felt a cold chill settle in his stomach. He had just made a terrible mistake. The store fell into an eerie silence. The other employees, usually occupied with their own tasks, had stopped what they were doing. Customers exchanged curious glances, some pretending not to listen while others blatantly watched the scene unfold. The weight of the moment pressed down on the clerk like a suffocating fog. As the woman disappeared into the back room, escorted by the manager and the suited man, the clerk's pulse quickened. He still didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: he had messed up. Badly. He looked around for support, but his fellow employees had quietly distanced themselves, avoiding eye contact. The realization clawed at his stomach. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was serious. The manager reappeared a moment later, her face stony. She motioned for the clerk to follow her. Without another word, she led him toward the same back room where the woman had gone. His heart pounded as he stepped inside. The atmosphere in the private office was entirely different from the showroom. There were no bright display lights, no polished cases showcasing extravagant jewelry. Instead, a large desk sat in the center of the room, its surface lined with neatly organized paperwork and a single, expensive-looking pen. The woman stood near the window, gazing out at the bustling street below. She hadn't said a word since she was ushered inside. The suited man stood at her side, his posture one of quiet reverence. The manager gestured for the clerk to take a seat. He hesitated, his mouth dry. "Ma'am, I..." The woman turned slowly, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They held a depth of experience, of understanding, disappointment, and something else he couldn't quite place. The silence stretched on before she finally spoke. "You refused to let me see a bracelet," she said calmly. The clerk swallowed hard. I didn't mean to offend you. I was just trying to guide you towards something more suited to your budget." The moment the words left his mouth, he realized his mistake. The woman's lips pressed together slightly, but she didn't show anger. Instead, she let out a soft sigh. The suited man turned to the manager. "Has this happened before?" he asked. The manager's jaw tightened. "Unfortunately, yes. This isn't the first complaint I've received about our staff making assumptions about customers." The clerk's stomach dropped. Others had complained? He had assumed his actions were just part of the store's exclusivity, a way to keep the brand's prestige intact. He never imagined it was a repeating issue, one serious enough to be discussed in a private meeting. The woman walked toward the desk, placing her hand lightly on the polished wood. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. The room tensed. The clerk shook his head quickly. I don't." Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "I co-founded this company." His breath hitched. The woman continued, her voice even and steady. "Years ago, when we first started, I insisted that our brand be about luxury, but more importantly, about experience. Not just for the ultra-wealthy. Not just for those who looked the part. We built this company to make people feel valued, no matter who they were." She paused, giving him a long, searching look. Somewhere along the way, that idea got lost. The weight of her words settled over him like a crushing wave. His mind reeled, trying to process everything at once. She wasn't just another wealthy client. She was the very foundation of the company he worked for. And he had disrespected her. The manager's voice was firm but careful. "You know what this means, don't you?" The clerk could barely find his voice. I understand." His hands clenched in his lap. He had worked at the store for years, priding himself on his ability to assess customers and determine who was worth the effort. It had been second nature to him. But now, for the first time, he saw it from another perspective. He had judged her, the owner of the company, based on her appearance. And he wasn't the only one. The woman sat down across from him. "Tell me," she said. "Why did you assume I wasn't worth your time?" The question made his breath hitch. He felt suddenly exposed, as if his years of carefully maintained confidence had been stripped away. I don't know," he admitted. Her gaze didn't waver. "You do. You just don't want to say it out loud." The room was silent. The air between them felt thick with unspoken truths. The clerk dropped his eyes. He knew exactly what she meant. He had dismissed her because of how she looked. Because she hadn't fit his idea of a worthy customer. And if he had done it to her, how many others had he done it to? The woman didn't push further. Instead, she leaned back slightly and gave him space to process. Then, she spoke again, this time softer. I didn't come here looking for an apology, she said. I came to see for myself if this problem still existed. She glanced at the manager, then back at the clerk. And now I know. A heavy silence fell over the room. The clerk felt his pulse hammering in his throat. Was this it? Was he about to lose his job? The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a mocking smile, nor one filled with pity. It was a knowing smile, a smile that told him she had seen people like him before. People who, despite their faults, had the capacity to change. What happens next, she said, depends on you. The words sent a chill down his spine. The manager and suited man exchanged a glance, both waiting for the clerk's response. And for the first time in his career, he had no idea what to say. The silence in the room felt suffocating. The clerk's mind raced, but no words came out. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had been called out for mistakes before, every employee had, but this was different. This wasn't about a simple error in judgment. This was about the very way he saw people. And the worst part? She wasn't even angry. The woman, the owner, had every reason to be furious, to fire him on the spot, to humiliate him in front of his peers. Instead, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't just disappointment. There was something else. Something that made his stomach churn. It was expectation. She was waiting for his response. He swallowed hard. The manager shifted slightly, her arms crossed. The suited man remained silent, his expression unreadable. The woman leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. Tell me something, she said. If I had come in wearing an expensive dress, carrying a designer handbag, would you have refused to show me the bracelet? The question hit him like a slap. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Because he knew the answer. Of course, he wouldn't have refused. He would have welcomed her with a smile, offered her a drink, given her the full VIP treatment. He had done it dozens of times before. The realization made his chest tighten. He had always told himself he was simply doing his job, helping the right customers, making sure his time wasn't wasted. But now, faced with the truth, it felt different. It felt ugly. The woman didn't press him for an answer. She didn't have to. She could see it in his face. She sighed softly, shaking her head. You know, she said, when I started this company, I made a promise to myself. I wanted it to be different from the others. Luxury, yes. Prestige, of course. But never exclusion. Her eyes flickered to the manager. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. The manager looked down, shame flickering in her eyes. The clerk shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The woman turned back to him. I won't pretend to be surprised by what happened today, she said. I've seen it before. I've lived it before. Her voice was calm, but there was something in it, something personal. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. I grew up in a small town, she said, almost to herself. My family didn't have much. My mother worked 2 jobs, my father did whatever he could to keep food on the table. I remember watching women walk into jewelry stores, trying on beautiful things, while my mother and I stood outside, looking through the glass. Her gaze lifted, locking onto his. I remember how the clerks used to look at us. The clerk's throat felt tight. She continued, her voice soft. When I was in my early 20s, I walked into a store. I had saved up for months to buy a simple gold necklace. And you know what happened? He already knew. The clerk refused to let me try it on, she said. He told me, very politely, that it was out of my budget and suggested I look at the silver section instead. She let the words settle. I left without arguing. without making a scene. But that moment stayed with me. The room felt heavy, the weight of her words pressing down on all of them. The woman tilted her head slightly. "Now, tell me," she said. "How many people have you treated the way that clerk treated me?" He had no answer. Because the truth was unbearable. The woman didn't push further. Instead, she stood up, smoothing out her blouse. "I didn't come here today expecting to fire anyone," she said. "I came to see for myself if this store, my store, was still upholding the values I built it on." Her eyes softened just a fraction. "What happens next is up to you." The manager stiffened. "What do you mean?" The woman turned to the clerk. "I can let you go right now," she said simply. "And I have every right to." The clerk's stomach dropped. "Or," she continued, "I can give you a chance to prove that you can change." The words stunned him. A second chance? The manager looked as surprised as he felt. The woman crossed her arms. "I don't believe in punishing people for their ignorance," she said. "But I do believe in holding them accountable." She studied him carefully. "So, here's the deal. You have 1 week to prove to me that you've learned something from this." The clerk blinked. 1 week? 1 week, she repeated. "You will spend that time shadowing different employees, every department, not just sales. You'll listen to real customers. You'll see what happens when someone is dismissed before they even get a chance to speak." She let the words sink in. "If, after that, I don't see a genuine change, you're gone." The clerk's heart pounded. This was his only chance. The woman turned to the manager. "I expect you to oversee this personally." The manager nodded quickly. "Of course." The woman exhaled, glancing at the suited man. "I think we're done here." The clerk felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. A week. That was all he had. As he stood, his mind whirled. He had spent years thinking he was right, that his way of handling customers was efficient, that he was simply protecting the store's brand. But now, for the first time, he wondered, had he been wrong all along? And more importantly, could he really change? The weight of the moment stayed with him long after he left the office. As the door shut behind him, he could feel the stares of his co-workers burning into his back. The showroom was quieter than before, the usual hum of conversation replaced with hushed whispers. He didn't have to hear the words to know what they were saying. What happened? Did he just get fired? What did she say to him? He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was too clouded with the conversation that had just taken place. She had given him a second chance. Why? The question gnawed at him as he moved toward the employee lounge. He had expected a scolding, maybe even immediate termination. Instead, she had offered him an opportunity, to prove himself, to learn, to change. It wasn't a punishment. It was a test. And if he failed, there would be no excuses. The next morning, he reported to work earlier than usual. The manager was already waiting for him. She wasn't smiling. "You'll start by shadowing the customer service team," she said briskly. "Follow me." He obeyed without a word. As they walked through the store, he noticed something strange. The customers he once would have ignored, an older woman in a faded coat, a young man in sneakers, suddenly stood out to him. He caught himself making judgments before immediately shaking them away. That's exactly what she wanted me to see. They reached the small desk near the back of the store, where a customer service representative sat answering calls. "Sit," the manager instructed. He did. For the first few minutes, he listened in silence. The rep handled everything from complaints about damaged shipments to customers who needed assistance choosing a gift. It was tedious, repetitive work, far from the glamour of the sales floor. Then, the first lesson came. A middle-aged woman walked up to the desk, clutching a small jewelry box. Her hands trembled as she placed it on the counter. "I bought this for my daughter's wedding," she said softly. "But, she never got to wear it." Her voice cracked. The clerk tensed. The representative, however, remained calm, her expression one of quiet understanding. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said gently. "How can we help?" The woman hesitated. I don't know if I should return it. It's beautiful, but it hurts too much to keep." The clerk watched, frozen, as the rep placed a hand over the box. "Would you like a moment?" she asked. The woman nodded, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in his career, the clerk saw something he had never noticed before. Jewelry wasn't just about wealth. It was about emotion. Memories. Love. Loss. All this time, he had thought his job was to sell luxury. But it was more than that. It was about making people feel something. The day continued, and with every interaction, the clerk's perspective began to shift. He saw the elderly man who came in every month just to look at the necklace his late wife had loved but never bought. He saw the nervous young man searching for the perfect engagement ring, his hands shaking as he flipped through the selection. He saw the mother saving up for a birthday gift, carefully choosing something special for her daughter. None of them flaunted wealth. None of them looked the part. And yet, their reasons for being there were real. By the time his shift ended, he felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Guilt. Not because of what had happened yesterday, but because of all the other days before it. How many people had he dismissed? How many stories had he ignored? As he left the store, the woman's words echoed in his mind. "What happens next depends on you." And for the first time, he knew exactly what he had to do. The next morning, the clerk walked into the store with a different mindset. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about commissions. He wasn't scanning for high-profile clients or mentally sorting customers into worthy and unworthy categories. Instead, he was watching. Listening. The lessons from the previous day stuck with him. He had seen how jewelry wasn't just a luxury, it was personal. It carried memories, dreams, and sentimental value that had nothing to do with price tags. And today, he would be learning something even more uncomfortable. The manager greeted him with a curt nod. "Today, you're shadowing the repair department." The repair department? The clerk frowned. He had always considered repairs an afterthought, something handled by the back-end staff while he focused on sales. He had never given much thought to what happened to jewelry after it left the showroom. That was about to change. The first customer of the day was an older man, his posture slightly hunched as he approached the counter. In his hand was a faded velvet box. He opened it carefully, revealing a delicate gold wedding band. "My wife wore this for 47 years, the man said softly. "It broke last week." The repair technician, a kind-eyed woman named Elora, inspected the ring with gentle fingers. "We can fix this," she assured him. The man let out a breath of relief, his fingers trembling as he handed it over. I just can't bear to see it broken," he admitted. "She passed away last year, but I still keep it with me." The clerk froze. This wasn't just a ring. This was a piece of someone's life. Elora nodded. "I understand," she said. "We'll make sure it looks as good as new." The man's eyes glistened. "Thank you," he whispered. As he turned to leave, the clerk finally found his voice. "Sir," he said before he could stop himself. The man turned, his gaze expectant. The clerk hesitated. Then, with genuine sincerity, he said, "I'm sorry for your loss. That's a beautiful ring." The man smiled, a real, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said. "It means the world to me." The moment stuck with him long after the man had left. It was such a simple thing. A few words. A small acknowledgement. And yet, it had meant something. As the day went on, the clerk saw countless other customers, each with their own stories. A woman came in with a broken pendant, the last gift her father had given her before he passed away. A young couple brought in a scratched engagement ring, worried they had damaged something priceless. A teenage girl handed over a bracelet from her grandmother, hoping to restore it to its original shine. Every item was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a connection to someone or something important. And for the first time, the clerk understood that. Later that evening, as he clocked out, he spotted the woman, the owner, standing near the front of the store. She wasn't shopping or inspecting the employees. She was simply watching. Their eyes met. She raised an eyebrow, silently asking the question she didn't need to say out loud. "What did you learn today?" The clerk hesitated, then nodded. He had learned more in 2 days than in his entire career. It wasn't just about selling jewelry. It was about serving people. The woman gave him a small, approving smile. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt like he was changing. The next morning, the clerk walked into the store feeling different. He wasn't sure what had changed exactly, but something had. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like just a salesman. He felt like he was learning, like he was seeing customers in a way he never had before. And today, he was about to learn another lesson. The manager greeted him with a nod. "Today, you're shadowing deliveries and custom orders." Deliveries? That seemed even more removed from the high-end sales floor than repairs had been. But he didn't argue. Not anymore. He followed a woman named Lena, who managed special orders. She handled custom jewelry pieces, ones that were engraved, designed from scratch, or delivered to customers personally. Their first stop was an assisted living home. "Wait, we do deliveries to places like this?" the clerk asked as they walked inside. Lena gave him a knowing smile. "Not every customer can come to us." She led him to a common area where a frail-looking elderly woman sat in a wheelchair, staring out the window. A nurse greeted them, speaking softly to the woman. "Mrs. Harrington, your package is here." The woman's eyes slowly turned toward them, and for a moment, there was no recognition. But when Lena placed the small box in her hands, something changed. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing a small, delicate locket. The woman gasped. "My husband's engraving." She turned the locket over, running her fingers across the words inside. "Forever and always." Her shoulders shook as she clutched the necklace to her chest. "I lost this years ago," she whispered. "He gave it to me on our wedding day." Lena smiled gently. "Your granddaughter had it remade for you." The elderly woman's eyes glistened. "I never thought I'd see it again." The clerk swallowed hard. It was just a necklace. Just jewelry. And yet, in that moment, it meant everything to this woman. As they left, he turned to Lena. "How often do we do this?" She shrugged. "Every week. Jewelry isn't just about sales. It's about memories. You'd be surprised how many people just want to feel close to someone they've lost." The clerk was silent the whole way back to the store. Their next customer was a young woman, barely in her 20s. She was waiting anxiously at the counter when they arrived, twisting her fingers. "Is it ready?" she asked, voice tight with anticipation. Lena handed her a small velvet box. The woman took a deep breath and slowly opened it. Inside was a custom engagement ring, delicate, unique, with an intricate design unlike anything on the showroom floor. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "He's going to love it," she whispered. The clerk furrowed his brow. "Wait, you're proposing to him?" She nodded, grinning through her tears. He always joked that I'd never ask first. So I'm proving him wrong. The clerk blinked. He had sold hundreds of engagement rings over the years. But never once had he thought about the story behind them. By the time they returned to the store, something had shifted in him. He had spent years believing that luxury meant exclusivity. That his job was to serve only the wealthiest customers, the ones who could afford to buy without blinking. But today, he had seen something different. Jewelry wasn't just about wealth. It was about meaning, connection, memories. And for the first time, he felt ashamed of how he had treated people. The woman, the owner, was waiting when he returned. She studied him carefully. Well? The clerk let out a breath. I get it now. She raised an eyebrow. Do you? He nodded. Jewelry isn't about money. It's about what it means to people. A small smile touched her lips. Good. He swallowed, feeling something he hadn't expected. The need to do better. I don't just want to pass this test, he said suddenly. I want to change. For the first time, the owner looked genuinely pleased. Then prove it, she said. And he intended to. The next morning, the clerk arrived at the store before opening hours. For the first time in years, he wasn't just showing up for a job. He wasn't coming in just to make commissions or to judge which customers were worth his time. Today, he was here to learn. And this time, he wasn't being assigned to a department, he was being tested. The owner had given him 1 week to prove himself. Now, it was up to him to show that the lesson had truly changed him. His first opportunity came quickly. A woman entered the store hesitantly, clutching a small fabric pouch. Her clothes were simple, her shoes slightly worn, and her posture uncertain. A week ago, the clerk wouldn't have looked at her twice. Now? He noticed everything. She was nervous. Not because she didn't belong here, but because she thought she didn't. He approached her with a genuine smile. Good morning. How can I help you today? The woman hesitated. I'm not sure if I'm in the right place. There's no wrong place, he said warmly. Tell me what you're looking for, and we'll figure it out together. She exhaled shakily and opened the pouch. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, its chain slightly tarnished, the pendant missing a stone. It was my mother's, she explained softly. She passed away last year. I don't have a lot of money, but I wanted to see if it could be fixed. The old version of himself would have dismissed her, waved her toward a lower-tier section, or told her repairs weren't worth the cost. But today? He saw the way her fingers trembled as she held the necklace. He saw the love and loss in her eyes. He nodded. We can definitely restore this. Her eyes widened. You can? Absolutely, he assured her. And if you'd like, we can clean and polish the chain as well, it'll look as good as new. She let out a breath, and her shoulders relaxed. How much will it cost? She asked cautiously. The clerk hesitated. The repairs wouldn't be cheap. But something told him that wasn't the most important thing here. Let me check with our repair team, he said. I'll see what we can do to keep the cost down. Her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. And in that moment, he realized something. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about sales. He was thinking about people. Later that day, the owner passed by him as he worked. She didn't say anything, just watched. And for the first time, the clerk wasn't nervous under her gaze. He knew he was doing the right thing. Another customer arrived in the afternoon. A young man in construction clothes, his hands rough and calloused, stepped inside. The old version of himself would have ignored him completely. Instead, the clerk greeted him with a smile. Welcome. What can I help you find today? The man hesitated, glancing around uncertainly. I need a ring. The clerk nodded. Engagement? The man grinned sheepishly. Yeah. My girl's been with me through a lot. I don't have much, but I want to get her something special. The clerk didn't push him toward the most expensive case. Instead, he asked, "Tell me about her." The man lit up. She loves simple things. She's not flashy, but she's got this quiet elegance. And she loves emeralds. The clerk smiled. I think I have the perfect ring. He led him to a modest but stunning silver band with a single emerald set in the center. Elegant, understated, and perfect. The young man's eyes widened. That's it, he breathed. That's her. The clerk felt something warm in his chest. A week ago, he would have judged this man. Today, he saw him for what he really was, a man in love, trying his best. And for the first time, he understood that his job wasn't just about selling jewelry. It was about helping people tell their stories. At the end of the day, the owner called him into her office. He didn't feel the same fear he had the first time. Instead, he stood tall, ready. She studied him for a long moment, then spoke. You understand now, don't you? The clerk nodded. Yes. She leaned forward. Then tell me, what is the real purpose of this store? He knew the answer immediately. It's not about exclusivity, he said. It's about people. Their moments. Their memories. The owner's lips curved into a smile. And he knew. He had passed the test. The store had never felt different to him before. For years, it had just been a workplace, a showroom filled with expensive items, a place where he measured people based on what they could afford. But now? Now, it felt like something else. It felt like a place of stories. Of love, of memories, of moments that mattered far beyond price tags. And for the first time in his career, he felt proud to be a part of it. After his meeting with the owner, the manager pulled him aside. I don't know what you said in there, she admitted, but whatever it was, she looked impressed. The clerk smiled, a real, genuine smile. I finally get it, he said. The manager raised an eyebrow. Get what? That this isn't just about sales, he said. It's about the people who walk through those doors. The manager studied him for a moment. Then, with the smallest nod, she patted him on the shoulder. Good, she said. It's about time. The real test came later that day. A woman walked into the store. She was well-dressed, carrying an expensive bag, her shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. The old version of himself would have rushed to greet her, assuming she was a big spender. But he didn't do that now. Instead, he simply waited. The woman walked toward a case displaying engagement rings. She studied them in silence, her fingers lightly touching the glass. The clerk approached with a warm smile. Looking for something special? She glanced up, her expression guarded. I don't know. She hesitated. My fiancé, he passed away 2 months ago, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The clerk froze. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he finally understood what this moment meant. She wasn't here to buy a ring. She was here because she needed closure. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the rings. Then, finally, she let out a small, shaky breath. I wanted to see what we would have picked. The old version of himself would have pushed a sale. He would have tried to convince her to buy something anyway. But instead, he simply nodded and said, Would you like to hold one? She blinked, surprised. Is that allowed? Of course. Carefully, he took out a simple, elegant band, something timeless. She reached out and ran her fingers over the metal. After a long moment, she whispered, "He would have loved this." The clerk didn't push further. He didn't sell. He just listened. Because today, that's what she needed. At the end of the day, the owner found him as he was closing up. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You passed." He smiled. "I know." She tilted her head. "And what did you learn?" He met her gaze. "That this job isn't about selling jewelry." Her lips curved into a smile. "Then what is it about?" He exhaled, the answer coming to him instantly. "It's about treating everyone like they matter." Her smile widened. "Good." Then, for the first time, she extended her hand. And as the clerk shook it, he realized something. This wasn't just a second chance. It was a new beginning. The store opened as usual the next morning, the polished glass cases gleaming under the showroom lights, the scent of fresh flowers near the entrance welcoming customers inside. But for the clerk, everything felt different. For years, he had walked through these doors without thinking, without seeing. He had judged people at a glance, deciding who was worthy of his time and who wasn't. Now, he saw everyone. Not their clothes. Not their wallets. But their stories. His first customer of the day was a young woman, barely out of college, her hands fidgeting as she stood near the necklace display. The old version of himself would have barely noticed her. Now, he walked over with a warm smile. "Looking for something special?" She hesitated. "It's for my mom. She's been having a tough year. I just want to get her something nice." The clerk nodded, scanning the case. "Tell me about her. What does she love?" The young woman brightened. "She loves blue. She always says it reminds her of the ocean, even though she's never been." The clerk smiled. "Then I think I have the perfect piece." He carefully selected a delicate sapphire pendant, not the most expensive, not the flashiest, but meaningful. When the woman saw it, she gasped. "It's beautiful. She's going to love it." And for the first time, the clerk realized something: this job wasn't about selling jewelry. It was about helping people express love in ways words never could. Later that afternoon, the owner stopped by. She didn't ask if he had learned his lesson. She didn't need to. Instead, she watched him work for a few minutes before giving him a nod of approval. The test was over. He had changed. And not because he had to. Because he wanted to. As the day wound down, a familiar figure entered the store. The elderly man from the repair department, the one who had brought in his late wife's wedding band, walked up to the counter. The clerk recognized him instantly. "Mr. Daniels," he said warmly. "I was hoping I'd see you today." The man's eyes crinkled with gratitude. "You remember my name?" "Of course." The man pulled something from his pocket, the restored wedding band, gleaming like it was brand new. He held it up for the clerk to see. "She's still gone," he said softly. "But this, it makes me feel like she's still with me." The clerk felt a lump in his throat. He had sold 100 diamond bracelets, 1,000 engagement rings. But this moment? This was what the job was really about. As the last customers left and the store lights dimmed, the clerk took a deep breath. He had spent years thinking success meant money, exclusivity, prestige. But he had been wrong. Success wasn't about numbers. It was about people. It was about seeing them. Hearing them. Making them feel valued. And that was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life.